Hello, and welcome back to the pricing channel for small businesses. A little over a year ago, we did a video talking about the likelihood of inflation. In fact, it was video 8 in this series from April of 2021, and we'll put a link to that video in the description section. But the mystery about inflation is over, because it's here for sure. And you may also be hearing things about upcoming recessions, or maybe something called stagflation. But what do all those terms mean? And what do they mean for your business and any pricing moves you may be thinking about making? Well, sit tight, because we're going to cover all of that in the following presentation.
So we're going to talk about inflation, recession, and stagflation. What do these terms mean, and what impact might they have on our businesses? Well, for one thing, we know inflation is for real. And currently, it's clocking in at about 8.2% as of September of 2022. In the news, you also probably hear talk about a possible recession coming up in the near future. Few stories, commentators are even talking about something called stagflation, which may come even further down the road. So let's take a look at each of these economic terms and discuss their likely impact on your business profitability and your ability to price your products and services. So let's start with inflation, because this is the issue we're dealing with right now. In economic terms, inflation is defined as a general rise in the price level in an economy over a period of time. And the effect of this is each unit of currency buys fewer goods and services. And consequently, inflation reflects a reduction in the purchasing power per unit of money. Now, what's the bottom line of this? Well, first of all, in inflationary times, the purchasing power of our currency diminishes, and we see this manifested as an increased cost for the goods and services we buy, both for our business and also in our personal lives. So what does this look like in the real world? Well, we can illustrate this with an example. Let's pretend for a moment that back in 1960, your grandparents decided to take $10,000 and hide it under their bed mattress so that someday, way off in the future, they could give that to you as a gift when you needed it. Okay? Well, the good news is today is the day they're going to give you that $10,000. The bad news is in 2022, that $10,000 they hid under the bed mattress is only worth $998.95 in purchasing power. What that means is, over the 62-year period between the time they hid the money and the time they handed it to you, inflation has eroded basically 90% of the purchasing power of that gift. Now, what does that mean in real tangible terms? Well, back in 1960, with $10,000, you could go out and you could buy a car. In fact, with $10,000, you could go out and buy 2 cars. And even more than that, with $10,000, you could literally go out in 1960 and buy 3 cars. So how much of a car can you buy with $998.95? Well, maybe that much. Maybe you can get a tire, or maybe you can get a hubcap. That's about it. That's what happened to that $10,000. So, what can small businesses do to cope with inflation? Well, the key issue here is to maintain your profitability so that you can generate enough cash to pay your bills. So one of the things we need to be on the lookout for is price increases from our suppliers. You or somebody in your business literally needs to look at every invoice you receive and compare it to earlier invoices to see if they have slipped a price increase in on you. Likewise, you have probably had to increase the wages that you're paying to your workers in order to keep them. And so you have to factor that into the cost of you doing business. And both of these things, supplier price increases and wage increases, hit you in the cost of goods sold part of your business, as well as in the overhead part of your business. How do we get around this, or how do we cope with this? We've got to be raising prices in order to mitigate the effect of these cost increases. Now that's a touchy topic for small business owners because we don't like to raise prices, but you've really got to be diligent about raising prices as soon as you get these cost increases so that you maintain your profitability. Also, you might be able to shift the mix of products or services you sell to more valuable products and services in order to maintain profitability. Another thing you can do is something that's called an 80-20 analysis of customer profitability or product profitability. One of the things that's noticed in businesses is if you plot profitability versus, say, your products, and you rank them from the most profitable product to the least, what you find out is something like about 80% of your profitability comes from just 20% of your products. It's the same way with customers. If you plot profitability versus your customers, ranking them from most valuable to least valuable, you'll find out that about 80% of your profits come from 20% of your customers. So for those customers that aren't generating much profit, or from those products that aren't generating much profit, you might want to consider significant price increases to those in order to boost overall profitability of your business. You also might have to consider some business model pivots. During COVID, a lot of people went to dash delivery, curbside fulfillment, those types of things. Those things might be too expensive right now. Customers may not be willing to pay for those. And so we may have to pivot back to a lower cost model that essentially delivers more value to the customer, or at least makes them think they're getting more value. And why is all of this so important? Because what we're trying to do is maintain profitability, that is generating profits, which is equal to generating cash, which helps us to pay our bills so that we can survive. All right, let's turn to recession. What the heck is a recession? Well, there are different definitions of recessions, but one definition that was kind of agreed to back in the 1970s was the definition where a recession is 2 consecutive quarters of declining gross domestic product. In other words, that's 6 months of declining gross domestic product. Okay. Now, in 2021, the gross domestic product of the US economy was almost $23 trillion. What is the gross domestic product? Well, it's the total monetary or market value of all the finished goods and services produced within a country's borders in a specific time period, a year. All right. So what we're saying is a recession is a period of falling demand for goods and services, which leads to a lower level of general economic activity. And if we get 2 quarters of that, or 6 months, then we define that as a recession. Now, having said that, so far in 2022, we have seen 2 quarters of reduced GP. But the question is still out whether the reductions are enough to really qualify this as a recession. So we don't have a general consensus on that yet. If we do get into a recession, what we don't know at this point is how severe it will be and how long that recession will take place. So what does a recession do to our businesses? Well, when consumers have less money to spend, they buy fewer goods and services. One of the reasons consumers can have less money to spend is due to unemployment. Typically in a recession, the unemployment rate goes up significantly. And so people have less money to spend on goods and services. Your business will typically see this as a lower demand for what you sell, whether it's products or services or both. Now, if you're in a business that sells things that people need, like food, shelter, other necessities of life, you may not see a great drop in demand during a recession. But if you sell things that people want but don't need, you might see a large drop in demand. And so if you sell food, for example, you're a grocery store, convenience store, something like that, you may not see a great drop in demand because people still have to eat. On the other hand, if you sell fancy $150,000 speedboats, you may see a significant drop in demand because people tend not to buy $150,000 speedboats when they're having trouble putting food on the table at home. So the bottom line of this is, in a recession, discretionary spending tends to be the type of spending that goes way down. Also, customers can change their buying habits as they become laser focused on getting the most value they can out of every dollar they're spending. And so instead of buying a particular product in a fancy package, they may change to literally the same product that comes in a generic brown package at a slightly lower price, thinking that I don't want to pay for that fancy package. I just want to pay for the item that I need. So we need to be watching out for customer buying habit changes. Now, what can small businesses do to cope with a recession? Well, one of the things we can do is to carefully consider reducing our inventories. That is, inventories of raw materials, inventories of work in process, things that we're in the process of building. Also, reducing inventories of finished goods. If we do this, this frees up more cash that we can spend on essential business expenses. Also, we can look at carefully reducing those business costs that do not impact our capability. For example, if we're seeing lower demand for our products and services, we may have to reduce our direct payroll. And yes, that means cutting back hours of employees. Sometimes it means furloughing or laying off employees temporarily so that we can lower expenses and match that direct labor to the true demand. Same thing with overhead. There might be some overhead expenses that we can cut out for a period of time so that we can conserve cash. We also want to focus on products and services that provide immediate value to customers, or at least the perception of value. Like I mentioned earlier, people may view products sold in generic brown packaging more favorably, particularly if they're a little bit less than the same product in a fancy package, because they don't want to pay for the packaging. They want just the product. Also, if we are in a business that sells more discretionary types of items that are really satisfying people's wants and not their needs, we can still try to market these offerings as necessities, not as discretionary items. An example of this would be if you run a fancy high-end coffee shop, you can advertise your $10 coffee offering as a necessity. You need this coffee offering to help relieve the stress you're under during these difficult economic times. And shouldn't you do this because aren't you worth it? You know, that sends a message to someone that, hey, you have permission to do this even though you're stressing about the economy. All right, the last topic, stagflation. What the heck is that? Well, stagflation, or sometimes called recession inflation, is an economic situation in which the inflation rate is high, but economic growth slows down. And unemployment tends to remain stubbornly high during this period of economic turmoil. In some ways, it's about the worst economic condition for small businesses to be in, really any business, but particularly small businesses. Because here's the problem. At the same time, you may be experiencing shrinking sales for your products and services, your costs are still continuing to increase at a significant rate. Shrinking demand tends to cause a loss in pricing power as competitors cut prices in order to keep sales coming in. And so the situation is that stagflation literally strangles your profitability. Back in the early 1980s, this country went through a period of stagflation, a really serious period of stagflation. Inflation was still running over 10%. The unemployment rate was something on the order of 10%. This was a killer for the airlines industry because while they were having a terrible time trying to get people just to fly, their costs for payroll and their costs for fuel were still rising at double-digit rates. And so they literally had to slash their prices to the bone just to get people to sit in a seat in an airplane. The result of this was they were losing hundreds of millions of dollars per month. The long-term impact of this is that many airlines were seriously damaged by this economically. And so for the next 10 to 15 years, there was a large string of mergers and bankruptcies, which caused big names like TWA, Eastern, Pan Am, Northwest Airlines, People's Airlines, they just totally disappeared. They were either acquired by the survivors of this or they just went flat bankrupt. So the problem here is costs continue to rise at a significant inflationary rate. Revenues stall or decline due to reduced demand, which is lower sales, and revenues are impacted by lower prices as competitors tend to really compete against each other by slashing prices in order to keep demand coming through the door. So what can small businesses do to cope with stagflation? Well, probably the most important thing you can do is to start today, building a cash reserve. You might call it a war chest, in advance of this declining or negative net income that you might experience due to stagflation effects. Ideally, this reserve will carry you or carry the business for 12 months or more. You may not lose money every month, but you may have a bunch of months where you do lose money and a lot of months where you don't make very much money. This reserve could make the difference between surviving and bankruptcy. Also, consider all the actions we talked about under inflation. Also, consider those actions that we talked about during a recession. You may not be able to implement all of those, but anything you can implement, such as reducing costs, such as reducing inventories, such as taking price increases, any place that you can, all of those will help your business to survive by incrementally improving your profitability.
At this time, the Federal Reserve is talking a tough game about reining in inflation. That typically points to a future recession in their efforts to reduce economic demand. How that's going to affect your specific business will depend on the nature of your business and its financial health. We've talked about some things to be aware of and some tools you can use for surviving a recession. And of course, a big question is, will we see stagflation? A surge in oil prices could trigger that. And if stagflation does come, then having a healthy cash reserve on hand to weather a bout of stagflation could certainly help you sleep better at night. In either a recession or stagflation, it's the loss of pricing power that will be of serious concern. Understanding which of your products and which of your customers generates the most profitability for your business will help you focus more keenly on those profit generators. If you have any questions on these subjects, please leave those questions in the comments section. And please don't forget to hit that subscribe button down there so you don't miss a single video. And as always, we look forward to seeing you again.